pharmacology and toxicology. In terms of the learning outcomes, really you should be able to evaluate the current efficacy or safety information for a named drug at various stages of its development, to critically analyse the evidence, and to synthesise an opinion on a controversial topic in either neuropharmacology or toxicology, and finally to develop a research proposal and design experiments to address a project title. So these are essentially three distinct assignments, and we'll go into more detail about the other two assignments at a later stage. In terms of the drug portfolio, you're going to be asked to prepare a portfolio of studies, including summary paragraphs and tables, to evaluate the efficacy or safety of a marketed drug at different stages of its development. And this is going to be a third of your marks. The controversies essay is going to be, as it says in the tin, an essay about 2,500 words discussing a controversial topic in either neuropharmacology or toxicology, and you're essentially going to be assessed on your ability to critically analyse the information from the literature. Part of the module is going to be a research project or a presentation or outlining the rationale behind, and you're going to for the drug portfolio component, which is what you're starting, you're going to be required to prepare an evidence-based at various include the in vitro testing state, information from experiments related to cell lines or ex vivo preparations. The second component is that relating to animal testing or animal models of disease. The drug safety information has to do. And the third, the efficacy of the drug, or to include phases 1, 2, and 3, adding safety information or efficacy information. So for more specific guidelines related to the neuropharmacology one, what we expect from you is as follows. So the submission should be broken up into 5 sections. The first section should be 500 words at max, an introduction to your drug. What do we know about it, its mechanism of action, how was it discovered perhaps, and what does it actually do. The next 3 sections focus on the actual data from the literature, and for this you're going to have to do 2 things for each of them. One is to create a summary table, which will summarize the findings in each of the studies that you're using, and for each of the sections we'd like you to use between 5 and 10 references. The second part is going to be a 500-word summary of the literature under that particular heading. And the 3 sections are in vitro efficacy, efficacy in animal models, and clinical efficacy, so efficacy in human beings. And as I said, for each of them you provide a summary table with summary information for each of the references, and then a 500-word paragraph summary, so a written text of it. The final section, section 5, is going to be an overall summary, so this is 1,000 words max, on the efficacy or safety of the drug. With regards to the toxicology drug safety portfolio, again, section 1 should focus on an introduction to the drug, so telling us about what the drug does, how it works, its mechanism of action, and some background information about it. The sections 2, 3, and 4 should focus on toxicity in the in vitro side of things, so either cell lines or ex vivo preparations, the toxicity in animal models, and the clinical safety information, so that could be taken from phases 1, 2, 3, or 4 of clinical trials. And in each case you provide a summary of the literature, so key points and matching each reference, and then a paragraph, so a 500-word summary paragraph. And the final part, section 5, should be an overall 1,000-word summary on the safety of the actual drug. So this is where your opinion comes in. So in terms of what you're going to be asked to look at, you're going to be primarily looking at 2 major endpoints, one being efficacy, or if for the toxicology project it's going to be toxicity. And so it's important to define what each of these are. So efficacy is defined as the capacity or power to produce a desired effect. And in terms of the neuropharmacology portfolios, we're going to be looking at neurodegenerative or affective disorders. So you need to know what is being measured. So define what is getting better. And this needs to be clearly defined when you read a new paper on a particular study. So if it's an antipsychotic drug or an antidepressant or a drug for Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, you need to know what the endpoint is. What in this paper are they defining as getting better? What is the main outcome measure? And equally, if you're looking at the safety profile for the toxicology students, you need to be able to define what toxicity is. What are you actually measuring? Are you measuring cell death? Are you measuring tissue degeneration? When you're reading a new paper, you need to ask yourself this question: define what the toxicity is in this paper. It needs to be a measurable system of some kind. What can you actually measure? If it's a psychiatric or an affective disorder, are you going on an interview, a mood scale of some kind, or is it an actual biomarker? So is it a qualitative assessment of things like mood, feelings, personalities? Is it something like a quality of life or an improvement of symptoms? Are they using some kind of a rating scale, for example, like the DSM criteria? As we all know, there are going to be problems with these types of assessments, and this goes for both the efficacy and the safety. Because of things like assessor experience. Who is the individual that's making these decisions about the drug safety or the drug efficacy? Is the questionnaire that they're using valid? Does it have open or closed end questions? Is the scoring system inaccurate? Does it depend on the day that they actually carry out the baseline testing, what the baseline measurements were? And is it objective compared to something like a biomarker or biochemical data set? Ideally, we would like to eliminate bias, and ideally we would like to have non-invasive biomarkers that will allow us to measure things like efficacy and safety, but very often this isn't always possible. So maybe in terms of selecting your papers, you'd like to maybe bias it towards those that use biomarkers or a more valid system of measurement. You could have papers that use, for example, imaging or secreted biomarkers in peripheral fluids like serum, plasma, cerebral spinal fluid, saliva, or urine. For example, there are now tests that measure amyloid beta and tau levels in cerebral spinal fluid. A really important thing for your table, and it's something that should be quite clearly demonstrated and obvious in your table and your discussions for each of the sections, is the trial design. What type of trial was actually used? As you know from semester 1, there are a number of different types of trials and how they can be designed. You can have things like between patient comparisons where each patient only receives one treatment, or you can have a crossover trial where it's used as a within patient comparison, where each patient receives more than one treatment but at different times of the trial. Trials can be multi-centered, they can be run across more than location, and they can use things like blinding, single, double and triple blinding. So please pay particular attention to these kinds of information when you're looking at the human trial information. And most importantly, they need to clearly define at the start of the paper what efficacy is, what is an acceptable level. Rarely are drugs 100% effective, so they need to state quite clearly we're looking for X amount of improvement in Y number of patients, for example, in order to consider this efficacious or safe. So they need to clearly define as well their choice of control group or a comparator drug, for example, if they're trying to prove efficacy. And is the drug using an RCT format, a randomized controlled trial? I think most people would realise at this stage that the double-blind randomized controlled trials are the most scientifically pure design. So what you need to present then in terms of what it might look like, the summary table, there's an example of one shown here for efficacy, for example. And it should include pieces of information like the study details, what was the design, how many patients, what ages were there, how long was the trial, what were their inclusion and exclusion criteria, what were the interventions, so what dose of drug was given and how often, how many patients were on each of these interventions, what were the clinical assessments used, what were the effects that happened, and finally the reference. So you should have 5 to 10 of these in your tables for each of the different sections. Equally with the safety information, the summary table should include things like the types of patients, the trials design, the dose used and the frequency, and what were the adverse effects and what percentage of patients had these adverse effects. Sometimes they might give them as actual numbers of patients, sometimes they might give them as percentages. Whatever information you can get, you should include, and also give the reference for each of these studies. So in terms of your sources of information, a lot of this goes back to our semester 1 tutorial on researching literature. So I won't go through it in that much detail because it's covered there. Also, you can refer back to it. But the main sources of information should be your PubMed, your Web of Knowledge, Scopus, Science Direct, and specific medical journals as well that contain clinical trials, like your New England Journal of Medicine, Journal of the American Medical Association, the Lancet, the British Medical Journal, etc., etc. You can also find information on previous trials on clinicaltrials.gov or on the EMA website, the European Medicines Agency. Please do not rely on Wikipedia for these sources of information. They're highly vulnerable to false information and non-verifiable information. So as I suggested to you as well in semester 1, the Web of Knowledge is quite a useful tool to use, because particularly if you're looking through PubMed, you might not be sure which studies to focus on, and if you're looking for information specifically related to clinical trials, for example, it can give you the option to actually not only get a search results, like for this one here, for example, risperidone and schizophrenia and clinical trials and adverse effects, but it also allows you to rank them according to the number of citations, for example. So you can actually use the drop down menu here to sort by time cited to give you the ones that are the highly cited ones first. You can also use this, for example, for your rat models or your mouse models, and for toxicity in animal models, for example. In terms of specific journals, the Web of Knowledge also allows you to see what are the most cited and most used journals for particular topic areas. For example, in psychiatry, this is just an example of the journal citation reports, an option also available in the menu for Web of Knowledge. And it tells you that journals like Molecular Psychiatry, American Journal of Psychiatry, Archives of General Psychiatry, for example, are the most highly cited journals, and they might be the ones that you might want to go to first when looking for studies. For medical journals which contain clinical trials, as I said to you already, the New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, JAMA, Annals of Internal Medicine, British Medical Journal, these are the ones that tend to be used most often for clinical trials and publishing the data. And for toxicity as well, the annual reviews of pharmacology and toxicology are useful, as well as several other journals listed here. A useful type of paper for people would be to look at things called meta-analysis, where they're actually doing something similar to a drug portfolio already, and they perform literature searches and look at overall effects of efficacy and or safety as well, so toxicity. So the examples here of antipsychotics and lithium, for example. So you can actually specifically type in systematic reviews and meta-analysis of lithium, risperidone, whatever it might be, and it'll give you particular papers that do this. This can also be useful for finding individual studies for your tables. So in terms of referencing, again, this is information that we've covered already in previous assignments, but just to make sure that you reference correctly and appropriately, that single authors are written as follows, with Murphy, comma, the year, and brackets on either side, for 2 authors and for 3 authors. Citations should appear in the text after a statement is made or at the end of a sentence, and to try as much as possible to use more than one reference in the text where possible, especially for general introductory paragraphs. The style we use, as always, is the Harvard reference style as mentioned in the handbook, and just be sure that you use some kind of a reference manager like EndNote or RefWorks, or there's many other types as well, and that you use the format correctly as outlined. In terms of the grading of the assignment, each of the different sections will get equal marks, so 5 sections worth 20 marks each. And within each of the data sections, then the table will get 10 marks and the paragraph will get 10 marks. When marking the tables, the following will be considered, like have you selected appropriate papers, have you extracted the appropriate information and relevant data from those selected papers, and is the data presented clearly? These are the criteria that need to be followed. And equally, when marking the summary paragraphs, the following will be considered, like do you effectively integrate the literature into the summary paragraph? Does the summary paragraph or paragraphs show evidence of critical reflection? Have you actually reflected on the data and given your own opinion on them? Are the summary paragraphs well written? Is it fluid? Is there fluid writing? Is there a lot of grammar mistakes, or is it grammatically correct? Is it succinct and to the point? And are the references appropriately cited as well? Of course, as always, there will be submission. The submission will go through Turnitin, and plagiarism score will be generated as always.